Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Zach Davis. Welcome to Learning Aloud. I'm joined today in our virtual studio by Juliet Kelso, a student in our Organizational Dynamics program here at Penn, rounding the corner of her final semester. She's currently conducting a study on tapping collective intelligence to unlock innovation in large software development companies. She's also writing a book on the topic under the working title, How to Build Cool Shit and Go Home: Simple Rules for Big Impact in Complex Innovation Systems. Her work has involved interviewing some of the best engineers, project managers, and executives from Google, Facebook, Amazon, NASA, and more. When she's not in the classroom, Juliet loves to travel and is hoping to get back to more of that as the pandemic draws to a close. Juliet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.
So you've done some really interesting research with a number of large companies known for delivering disruptive innovation. So how did you get started?
Yeah, well, it really kind of started and has continued with stories, Zach. As I started my program at Penn, I knew that I had a deep fascination with big tech, particularly software developers. Because of the deep skill set they have that is totally different than the strengths I have myself. So there's a little bit of envy there. And then also because of the kind of agency software developers have to build the things that they imagine digitally. But I never really saw a place for myself in that world, even though I wished that I could, until about my second semester in the program at Penn. When I started to take stock of the skills and tools that I was learning and thought, where could this be best leveraged? And I started to think about my friends in software development at places like Oracle and Google, and remembering some of the stories from work that they've told me about frustrations around collaborating with colleagues, hating going to meetings, and difficulty getting their ideas off the ground. And so with that hunch, admittedly with a few biases attached to it as well around people in software development, I decided to start having more conversations with my friends of friends, as well as people who I actually just found on the internet through reading blog posts and reaching out to people, which has been a rewarding experience so far. But you asked me how I picked some of the companies that I've interviewed people from. It's really been from, doing a deep dive in my research around innovation and leading structure and enable more inclusivity in the innovative process. So that's brought me to companies like Google, Amazon, and NASA, as you said.
So I'm curious, you said that one of the things that struck me, you said that some of these friends that, in the stories that they were telling, they were having trouble getting their ideas launched, which just sounds strange. The things that you just described, hating meetings, them being unproductive, hard to get new ideas launched, like that sounds like the challenge that a lot of people face, and you wouldn't necessarily expect that from these innovative places. So can you talk a little bit more about that? What were you hoping to find out when you started to do those deep dives into those companies?
Sure. Well, exactly what you said. A lot of these companies are known for their innovation. And rightly so. Places like Google are leaders on that front. But they're not without their challenges. And I think a lot of it comes from continued ineffective meeting structuring. And also difficulty around bringing together groups cross-functionally. Oftentimes, these organizations are incredibly busy. They're strapped for time, and it can be difficult to make the case for slowing down to speed up.
So what do you mean by that? Tell me some more. The slow down to speed up. What are the benefits of that in a team when you're trying to introduce innovation?
Absolutely. Well, one of the first stories that I heard someone describe was a group of software developers had met with the sales team that sells their product for the first time in a long time. And through that conversation, they realized that collaborating with the sales team could yield some insights into how end users were actually engaging with the product. And they were able to make a tweak to said product that was revolutionary. But oftentimes, organizations don't think to bring together sales with engineering because they don't see the value in it. It can take up time, logistics. And that's kind of what I mean by slowing down in order to speed up, to take the time to have a meeting or even spend a whole day with an area of the organization that you may think doesn't understand your work. And maybe, you don't see the value in collaborating because your work is so different. But it's oftentimes in those intersections between groups that do very different work, but on the same product, where great innovation opportunities really lie.
So that's a powerful statement. So how would you propose, like, how would you increase those intersections, right? If that's where the magic happens, pulling these teams together, how would you increase those opportunities for that innovation to occur?
Yeah, well, there's a couple ways of structuring projects that software developers already use, like agile development, for example, that encourage cross-functional work especially by building teams of teams. So having small teams that are cross-functional, that are a part of a larger project, all working towards the same mission. But oftentimes, organizations even using agile don't necessarily include all stakeholders. So making sure that agile is truly being used effectively and satisfying all the original tenets of agile is a great way to start, and something that's really familiar to the organizations that I'm working with.
So you you mentioned that you've done, through the course of your research, you talked about the work around liberating structures. It seemed like that had a lot of influence on your research, some of the work that Keith McCandless has done, among others. So could you talk a little bit about that, and what is it about, that approach, or that I guess a number of different approaches that they talk about? How could a company leverage some of that to increase that interaction and that innovation?
Absolutely. Well, I'll begin by cluing in some of the listeners who maybe have never heard of liberating structures to what they are. They're these 33 really simple microstructures for how to run a meeting in a different way. The goal of liberating structures is to be more engaging, get all the voices in the room, and to unlock a culture of innovation. And liberating structures were actually one of my inspirations for the research I'm doing now. I actually took a class at Penn with Dr. Sharon Benjamin, and it was a fantastic experiential learning course where we actually practiced the 33 liberating structures. And went out and did projects with organizations, actually leveraging them and testing them. But, I think that I would say that I would leverage these approaches to improve the quality and efficiency of meetings and help orgs be more inclusive of the rich diversity of perspective they already have. Most orgs possess the knowledge and the creativity, the ideas that are necessary to handle some of their stickiest problems. They're just not mining them and supporting them effectively. I think liberating structures is a good way to start, to encourage people to share their ideas under rapid iterations in a psychologically safe structure, and to debate them effectively.
So you mentioned that throughout the course, it's very experiential, right? You were able to put some of these things into practice, different projects. Anything jump out at you, or is there any aha moments, or any of these projects where you put these things into place and you saw a dramatic change in the way that organization was able to conduct a better meeting?
Yeah, I think one of my big aha moments, especially with liberating structures, was in my own experience using them. To be honest, when I was first learning them, I wasn't totally sold. And it wasn't until Sharon Benjamin had us actually try them in class, and I felt the power myself, that I started to really think about them as a great nudge way to change the way that we're having conversations in organizations. And to give you a little bit more of an inside look at what that experience was, we were practicing the liberating structure called 1, 2, 4, all. I think it's probably the simplest one that people can, get the steps down really quickly and start using them in a meeting, your next meeting tomorrow. And how it works is the 1 and 1, 2, 4, all is you spend a minute solitary reflecting on the question at hand. You can jot down, journal, whatever. Just take a moment by yourself to formulate your thoughts. We know that adults really love and appreciate this kind of solitary moments to really think through a problem on their own. It's especially great for introverts to have that quiet time. And then the 2 in 1, 2, 4, all is you're paired with one other person in the group. And mind you, this can be done with a small group or an enormous conference room of people, which is one of the amazing things about liberating structures too. And so when you're in your pair, you share the ideas that you wrote down or thought through during that solitary 1 minute. And then you take that conversation that you had in the pairs and you're matched with another pair. So that's where the 4 comes from. And then after having a conversation as 2 pairs, you then announce, whatever you came up with, the 4 of you, to the whole group. And my first experience doing this, I realized, wow, this really helps me work through some of my nerves to speak up and share my ideas. I'm an introverted extrovert myself. And so I get energy from having conversations like the one we're having right now. But I do get nervous in a large group environment, especially if I'm the youngest person in the room, or most junior. I might have a great idea, but it's hard to speak up, especially when you know that maybe you don't have as much knowledge as other people in the room. So it's a great way when you're bringing together people across an organization, people of different ages, and encouraging them to all share their ideas.
And it's interesting that you share that too, because, one of the things that you mentioned was inclusivity, right? And helping unlock, right? So if there's someone like yourself that may have an idea that wants to share with the group, if you don't feel like you can, then the group's already going to be self-limited, right? There's things that are happening even in the brains of the people attending the meeting, as you were talking about that, I jumped to kind of one of the things that we've noticed over the past year. Now we're a year into a pandemic that drastically changed the way in which teams are interacting. So the in person is happening through a video camera, and that's the way you describe that breakout. Could be another really useful way for people to have more successful virtual meetings and to thrive in that virtual environment. Very easy to break those meetings down into breakout rooms and come back. But, I've noticed through talking with others that spend a lot of time in these virtual meeting sessions that it can be even harder to speak up, because now it's those cues that you might normally have when you're sitting in a room with somebody as someone leading the meeting or even others participating. It's easy for 1 or 2 people to dominate the conversation and not take full advantage of that. So that strategy, that struck a chord. As soon as you said that, I'm like, there's an absolute application of that, like in the next virtual meeting that I have later today.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is that most of these liberating structures were created before the pandemic, before remote work was the norm, the new normal. But I got to practice most of them in a virtual setting, and they work remarkably well. And there also have been a few new liberating structures that have been created by the larger liberating structures community in a virtual setting since the pandemic began.
And I think you said something else there really interesting, right? That new normal and this virtual thing that in many cases we were forced to embrace. Last year was the only way to get any work done. Now as you see companies start to return to what was the old normal, we may never go back fully to that. There's this virtual setting is always going to have a place, and I know in large part because there are different ways to unlock that innovation. So I think that's that's going to be a really important piece of company. It's another tool in the toolkit, right? Another way to conduct meetings, and another way to unlock that innovation within their people. So, one of the other things that you talked about, so I love the liberating structures, but I know that wasn't your only influence. And we talked about some other things about, the Jeff Bezos and the two pizza teams at Amazon. And, you talked also about, I think what you referred to as Conway's Law, which, the communication system will be reflected in the product that the team creates. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Those other outside influences, how they kind of combine with some of the things we have been talking about ways in which teams are communicating.
Yeah, absolutely, Zach. I think all of these points that you just brought up are so interesting because they create a little bit of tension in my research. Conway's Law, as you mentioned, is an adage that holds that the communication structures that create, in the case of Conway's research, software, will be reflected in that product. And since Conway came up with that law back in the 60s, it's been applied across all kinds of groups in their efforts to innovate. But the common interpretation of Conway's Law is that the smaller the communication structure, so the smaller the team, the better and more effective the communication will be, and the better the product will be. Well, obviously the problem with this is that the smaller the team you have, of course, the less diversity of perspective you have. So this is something that I'm still grappling with through my research. My work is not done, and I still have so many people left to interview. So I'm still answering that question. But I think that the best way I can describe it is, we found amazingly beneficial points about having, the Bezos two pizza team, for instance, and how small groups like that can build a lot of rapport quickly and make effective decisions, and have that agency to make those decisions on their own without getting, sign off from above. But of course, I think that you always need to consider that small group could have some biases because of the lack of diversity of perspective. So I think probably the best way to handle something like that is to think of these small teams as teams of teams. So having a larger team that they're associated with that is more diverse, that is more inclusive. So when it comes to these bigger, stickier questions, that the group could say, hey, wait, we might have some biases associated with this, or this is a big decision that could impact a lot of the end users. Maybe we should collaborate with the outside team that we're a part of on this. But yeah, as I said, I'm still doing work on that question and still grappling with it myself.
Sure, because that takes an incredible awareness from the people, from somebody coordinating the efforts of these teams. Really, because that was the first thing when we talked about that. It's like, hey, smaller teams, they're more nimble, they're more productive, but at the same time, the risk that you run with that smaller team is that you've fewer perspectives. Right. So there's more commonality, which could mean that you're actually, while you're more nimble, it could be less new ideas or less innovation as a part of that. So it's interesting to think, through where that balance is struck. Right. Like how do you incorporate that? So it's really, I see that as that's, not just incumbent, I guess, on the leader. But even within the teams themselves, so I think that speaks to a culture where people feel kind of empowered to speak up, right? To challenge that and to say, hey, we're not including. So how could organizations, how do you help foster the culture that supports that kind of awareness or that kind of perspective to maybe challenge the biases and to constantly, to challenge that in a healthy way to help improve it?
Absolutely. Well, I think this really starts with just having conversations about implicit bias and other kinds of biases that people have in organizations. It's one of the things where if it's constantly checked, constantly mentioned, a higher awareness kind of happens. But I'll also say that when it comes to ensuring that, you're not just making all decisions in small biased groups, is to create a culture that doesn't think in absolutes all the time. So even though we know it's great to have these small, agile teams, creating a culture that doesn't advocate for only ever making decisions in small teams or only ever collaborating on the small scale, it can be really attractive to have like the new hotness concept, like two pizza teams, small collaboration groups, and run with that idea as an absolute. But from the conversations I've had, it's definitely possible to circumvent some of these things like Conway's law, some of these forces working against big groups trying to collaborate effectively. And liberating structures is certainly one of those tools. There's several others as well. People in software development are really smart about using technology to circumvent some of the issues that break down communications in large groups. But it's also up to leaders to host things like innovation sessions that pull together large groups from across organizations to innovate together and to share information.
So you talk about those innovation sessions and going back to one of the first points you made around the stories that you heard and the way things that are kind of what got you started down this path. Could you share some of the things that surprised you about the stories, whether it was creative ways that those folks are trying to overcome these challenges or just the challenges themselves? I mean, what surprised you so far in your research? What did you uncover that you weren't expecting when you went in?
Oh, that's a great question. I think so many things so far. What has surprised me is the amount of weight put on small nudge changes that organizations can make, even when it comes to just how conversations are had and how meetings are run. I think of these things working against innovation as so big and complex. But the truth is that even a small nudge change to how a meeting is facilitated, like starting with an equalizing icebreaker question, for example, can have a massive impact. And even though I had some hunches around this to begin with in my initial exploration interviews, it reinforced from talking to some leaders in the software development world. I love particularly hearing stories about how leaders facilitate meetings in ways that model vulnerability and pull all voices into the room. But yeah, I was expecting things to be much more complex, much more difficult to understand in the world of software development. But it really oftentimes goes back to these very innate human topics. Because at the end of the day, technology, while it seems very distant from the human experience, is really a reflection of the human experience. Mm-hmm. And that theme has come back profoundly time and time again.
Technology is a reflection of the human experience.
Yes.
So can you expand on that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Well, it kind of goes back to what we were saying about Conway's law, right? The adage that the human communication structures that are creating things like algorithms will be directly reflected in the algorithm. So even though we think of algorithms and robots as the opposite of human oftentimes, you got to remember that it's people who are creating these things. It comes from our imagination, our ingenuity. So of course, our biases and our frustrations and our creativity and our hopes are all going to be reflected in the things that we design.
So, and when we were talking earlier, you had an interesting point that you made about about that reflection of the human experience, about particularly the role that social media plays. And I believe the comment you made was around social media in its current form, its current architecture, it was really built to maximize user addiction, not necessarily user benefit. So, how do we change that? What can we do to help break that down, or to help improve that?
Well, my view on this might be a little simplistic and reductive, but watching the documentary "The Social Dilemma," which went viral over this past year, which covers all the issues around social media algorithms optimizing for addiction metrics rather than customer value and variety, thus causing problems we are so familiar with in the media, like misinformation, the creation of echo chamber rabbit holes, etc. To me, I watched that documentary, and at the end of it, the first thought I had was, in these decision making rooms, in these design rooms, coming up with what these algorithms are going to optimize for, there couldn't have been enough diversity of perspective. And if that diversity of perspective was there, it couldn't have been leveraged, because I just can't believe that someone wouldn't have raised their hand and said, can't we try optimizing for variety instead? Can't we find a way to keep end users on our platforms just as long, but while optimizing for something that is delivering value to the consumer rather than focusing on addiction? So, as I said, I think my perspective might be a little simplistic on it. But I would love, it's one of my moonshot dreams to, after the pandemic, move out to Silicon Valley and be able to work with organizations like Facebook, like Instagram, on having innovation sessions for leveraging the kind of diversity of perspective they have to try to solve these really difficult problems around misinformation.
No, that's a fascinating perspective. You said, and one of the things that you said, it may be simplistic, but sometimes the simplest answer is the right one, right? I think it was interesting how you said that there's no way that we would have gotten to this place without somebody raising thetheir hand saying, hey, isn't there a way for everybody to benefit from this, not just to create this this addictive environment, this doom scrolling, and I think it's been heightened in the last few months, because that's how everybody's been interacting with the world, primarily is through social media platforms and different different virtual environments instead of face to face. So and that that work that you just talked about, and that kind of ties in, is that part of the cool shit that you're looking to build? Is that what we can expect to see some more of in this book that you're working on, without giving too much away? But is that where you're heading with the book, or is it building even in a different direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is intended really to be an extension of the research I'm doing at Penn, but to be a little bit more accessible, less academic, and also to be something that someone outside of the world of big tech can pick up and get something from. But absolutely, the intention behind the concept for the book, How to Build Cool Shit and Go Home, is meant to teach organizations some simple rules to build these structures for running meetings, for communicating, and for structuring their orgs in a way that's built for change and innovation, that's ready to take on tough problems and meet them with a mentality of inclusivity, and leveraging truly the diversity of perspective, so they can tap collective intelligence and really access the amazing richness of ideas within their own organization. I can speak a little bit about where I came up with the title. I know it's a little bit irreverent and a little odd. It actually came from an interview I was having with a friend who's also writing a book through my publishing company, who does software sales. And he said to me, Juliet, engineers just want to build cool shit and go home. They don't want to mess with all this organizational dynamics stuff, which made me laugh, obviously. But then I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. They just want to build cool shit and go home. And it's taken on a whole new meaning for me beyond the initial intent of my friend when he said it. Now, to me, what it means is how can organizations, as I said, build some of these communication structures that are ready for innovation, that are nimble, agile, and really primed to leverage their own collective intelligence so that people can go home at the end of the day knowing that they built an amazing company, they built an amazing culture, and they're going to be ready for whatever comes up tomorrow.
Nice. No, I love it. And it's, and it ties right back to, where you started with. This all started organically through conversations, right? And through recognizing that there seemed to be a missing piece in the conversations that you're having. You've got all these people that are doing these amazing things, but yet they're not necessarily, they might be doing the most advanced things technology wise or software wise, but not the most amazing things from an organizational dynamics perspective, or not taking advantage of different perspectives and tools to potentially create something even more innovative than what they'd come up with. I think it's fascinating. I think it's I love the title, and it sticks with you, right? And I think it gives it some credibility too. I mean, it came directly, literally, from the mouth of a friend focused in this area. So I think it's going to resonate.
Thank you so much, Zach. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I wish you a lot of luck with it. So I wanted to, one of the things that we started to do in Learning Aloud in season 2, which we're carrying forward to season 3, is our series of rapid fire questions. So these are questions intended to give our listeners, an even more rich perspective about the person on the other end of the microphone. So the only rules with this is you've got to answer the question, and the first word, the first up to a sentence that comes to mind, and then we'll go on to the next. But I have a couple of questions. There's 6 total. So are you ready for our rapid fire session?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So question number 1. So what is one thing you would most like to do in your life that you've not yet done?
Well, my first thing that came to mind was finish my book. So I guess that would be the first. Yeah, let's go finish the book.
Finish the book. All right. Second question. So in your opinion, what is one thing the world needs right now?
I think what the world needs right now is willingness to take risks on some of the things that are so pressing right now. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, which is very much interwoven into my topic, I think oftentimes there's analysis paralysis, particularly when it comes to issues of DEI in organizations. And I just wish that people would feel more comfortable taking a risk and giving it a try rather than being paralyzed.
That's a great point. I'll give that one sentence, a very long sentence, but that was one sentence, but a very, very good point. Question number 3. So if you were back in school today, so we'll have to go to undergrad or before then, since you're currently in the master's program. But if you're back in school today thinking about starting a career, what would you want to be when you grow up?
Oh, that's tough. Part of me wants to say a software developer, but I know I'd be no good at that. I'm honestly horrible at technology. Self-admitted, part of the reason why I have so much respect. Probably a consultant, which is the direction I'm taking my career in now.
Great. Question number 4. So what hobby, activity outside of your work brings you joy?
I absolutely love cooking. I'm vegan, so that definitely steers me in a direction of certain kind of cooking. But I love taking foods that I enjoyed before I was vegan and coming up with my own way of creating the vegan version of it. I love cooking for friends.
Question number 5. So what person, living or past, has inspired you the most?
Right now, it's got to be Clayton Christensen. Interview him for my book. But he was a brilliant thinker in the world of innovation. And I recommend that everyone read his books.
Thank you. Well, this kind of leads into the next question, which, but maybe not. So the last question is, what is the last thing that you read?
Doing Agile Right by Daryl Rigby and Company, who I know you actually interviewed for one of your podcasts.
Well, Juliet, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed our conversation. I love how we started kind of this story from how you had conversations around with friends and software developers, and you noticed this gap, and through your research and through your passion around innovation and helping teams work together, you've really developed some interesting theories, and I can't wait for the book to come out. So
Thank you so much, Zach.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I've been talking today with Juliet Kelso, student in our Organizational Dynamics program, scholar of innovative teams, aspiring author. You can find Juliet and her works on Medium, Juliet Kelso. There'll also be a link to the description in our bio. And you can also find her on LinkedIn. Both will be in the description at the end of the show. So special thanks to our technical producer, Dan Shields. I'm Zach Davis with Learning Aloud, a podcast for the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania.